Professor Ryder, when you were first beginning to work on what became your article, the cohort as a concept in the study of social change, what kind of issues were foremost in your mind? What kind of topics were current that led you to begin working on this particular article?
Well, I think the answer comes in two parts. In the first instance, I wrote my doctoral dissertation on the cohort approach, and the dissertation consisted of some 7 or 8 separate essays, each one following this particular approach. During my doctoral dissertation examination, I was asked why was I doing it this way, because it was a quite unfamiliar approach. And I answered then rather lamely that it seemed to me to be the natural way because it was the way that people live. And after the examination, one of the professors said to me, that wasn't a very good answer, you know, and I agreed, and put in the back of my mind the thought that I ought to come up with a better answer. Now, it took me some 15 years of looking here and there, keeping a big file that got larger and larger all the time, to get to the point where I had a rather considerable file of notes that I had to somehow or other convert into an article, and that was the article. Now, what I had started out with, of course, was a straightforward demographic question. How do you handle a particular table of statistics? And what I found when I started to explore the literature was that the same question had arisen in many different areas of study. It had arisen in such things as child development. It had arisen certainly in the area of history, in the study of literature, in the study of politics, that this was a much larger thing than a mere demographic technique. And I became interested in it, therefore, not only as a suggestion for demographers about how to do their work, but also as a suggestion for sociologists as to how they may reorient their thinking with respect to particularly the study of social change.
When you were writing this article over all these years, what sort of context did you have with other people, with other colleagues, with, say, for example, graduate students? When you had interchanges with people, what sort of people were these that you talked to about this?
Well, at the time I began my work on the dissertation, there was a small literature on the subject. The idea was certainly not of my invention within demography, but I was rather a heretic with respect to the idea, and in the 15 years that I was speaking about, during which I was developing the article, I was quite frankly doing it on my own. I was spending quite a bit of time at meetings attempting to convert people, if you will, to this new way of looking at things, but essentially meeting opposition or at least a doubt as to whether there was anything important here. And it became to some extent a cause for me, and I think it fair to say that I was working on it alone, although I found many people in the literature who would be soul brothers.
Mm-hmm. Would you say that would also have been true of the graduate students that worked with you during that period, or were they perhaps more receptive to the concept?
I had no graduate student who particularly oriented himself to this question. It was not until many years later that I was able to stimulate Andy Foster to become interested in the subject, and by many years later, I mean just within the last 5 years or so. The subject was a rather unappealing one for a graduate student, in part because there were very few bodies of literature, of data, that were fit for the subject. It required a very long time series at the least. Students, I think, were attracted more to something as of the here and now to do their dissertations on.
Would you say that there was any impact on you and your beginning to be involved in this issue of the embarrassment that many demographers felt when caught by the baby boom and surprised by that change? I mean, many demographers in the 40s were saying that we were in Spengler's decline of the West and that the birth rates would just keep going down, and then they were caught by this. Did that have any echo that affected you when you were beginning to think about this later?
Well, my original thinking on the subject was purely demographic, and it was very much part of the time of which you spoke, because I started my graduate work in the late 1940s, and at that time there was a great deal of restiveness on methodological fronts, and the restiveness focused on how badly the demographers had predicted the baby boom. Among the questions that were directed at the body of data was particularly the question of were we organizing the data in the correct fashion. Now, I must say that there was no explanation for the baby boom contained within the cohort approach. What happened was that if you organized data by cohorts, you got a somewhat more complicated story, which implicated very much the change in the time pattern of childbearing. And that did make for a more appealing account of what was going on than had existed before. What I'm trying to say is that equipped with the cohort approach prior to the baby boom, demographers would still have fallen on their faces, but perhaps not quite as badly.
Would have been a little different story.
A little different
with some
story.
different messages in it. Since that first article appeared, there have been not only more articles of your own related to this general theme of the importance of looking at things along the lines of the cohort's lifespan, but also work by other people in this area. What sort of impact do you think this article has had on the field? What sort of reactions have you had to it and to your work since then?
Well, I would distinguish the demographic side from the social sciences more generally. And on the demographic side, I think it's fair to say that a look at data from a cohort standpoint has become a standard approach, something that people are expected to be aware of at all times. It is found in most accounts. When textbooks are written, I think it's expected that they will have a section giving the indication of how to do it this way. It is also very important if you happen to be studying the instrumental variables, that is fecundability, contraceptive efficacy, and the like. It's almost impossible to conceive of not doing them by some kind of cohort approach. But I was also a member of a sociology department, and I was more interested in the extent to which sociologists would be taking this to heart. Now, I don't think very much has happened in the general sociological literature with respect to the cohort approach. There have been some important uses of it by people like Merton working on the sociology of science, but it has been a rather minor element in the armamentarium. On the other hand, there has been a great deal of growth in the interest in the process of aging in the population, in the study of the life cycles of people's experience, in general, a focus on the time pattern of people's activities of all kinds. And here, the cohort approach has become a major standard conventional item in the analysis. The National Institute of Aging, for example, would not be able to exist without it.
Okay. Well, thank you very much.
Right.